You're in the Navy. Let me guess, your whole job is smiling for recruitment posters and filing paperwork in an air-conditioned office. That's what he said to me, in front of 11 people, over a plate of my grandfather's slow-roasted turkey, with a smirk so wide it practically glowed under the dining room chandelier. The table went silent, not the polite kind of silent, either, the kind where you can hear the ice cubes settling in the water glasses. My husband's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His aunt's wine glass hovered in midair. Even the dog under the table seemed to hold its breath. He leaned back in his chair like a man who had just delivered the winning argument of his life, waiting for me to blush, or stammer, or laugh it off the way I always did. He expected silence to mean surrender. He had no idea what was coming. Before I could open my mouth, a single sound cut through the room like a rifle shot, the sharp, deliberate clink of a fork being set down against fine china. Not dropped, not thrown, set down, slowly, precisely, the way a man moves when he has spent a lifetime learning that the quietest gestures carry the most weight. Grandpa Thomas. 81 years old, a man who had said maybe 40 words all evening, who had watched nod along politely through an hour of bragging without so much as raising an eyebrow. That version of him was gone. In the space of a heartbeat, something ancient and steady rose up behind his eyes, and the warm, sleepy grandfather who had hugged us at the door an hour earlier evaporated completely. He set both hands flat on the table. He looked at my husband's cousin the way I imagine he once looked at men who tried to lie to him in rooms that mattered. "Son," he said, voice low, almost gentle, and somehow more frightening than if he'd shouted, "you'd better think very carefully about your next sentence." The color drained out of Bradley's face, so fast I actually felt sorry for him. "Almost. Stick with me until the end, because what happened over the next 10 minutes is the reason our family will never look at that dining room the same way again. My name is Emily Carter. I'm a lieutenant in the United States Navy, and if there's one thing 11 years of service has taught me, it's this. The people who need everyone to know how tough they are have usually never actually been tested. I didn't grow up dreaming about the Navy. I grew up in a small town 2 hours from the nearest coastline, the kind of place where the biggest excitement of the week was a Friday night football game under buzzing stadium lights. I joined at 22, half out of restlessness and half out of a stubborn need to prove something to myself, not to anyone else. Nobody in my family had served. I had no idea what I was walking into. What I found was a version of myself I didn't know existed. Somewhere between flight school and my first deployment, the nervous small-town girl who used to apologize for taking up space turned into someone who could hold a hover in 18-knot crosswinds, who could read a threat board in the dark and make a decision in under 4 seconds, who understood, really understood, that competence doesn't announce itself. It just shows up when it's needed and does the work. There's a phrase we use a lot in aviation: slow is smooth and smooth is fast. It sounds like a throwaway line until you've lived it. Panic is loud. Fear is loud. Insecurity is the loudest thing in any room. But the people who actually know what they're doing, the ones who have had their hands on the controls when it counted, they tend to get quieter, not louder, the more real the stakes become. That's the lesson I carried with me everywhere, including, apparently, to family dinners. I never talk about my job unless someone asks a real question. Not because I'm ashamed of it, I've never been prouder of anything in my life, but because I learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to someone who's already decided not to listen is a waste of breath better spent on people who actually care. My husband Mark understood that about me before I even had the words to explain it myself. He's a civilian, an architect, gentle in a way that used to confuse people who expected a military wife to be someone else entirely. He never once needed me to prove anything to him. He just held my hand under tables like this one and let me handle things at my own pace. Which is exactly what he was doing that October evening at Grandpa Thomas's house in Virginia, the week the leaves had just started turning that deep, burnt orange that makes the whole property look like it's on fire at sunset. Grandpa Thomas's house always smelled like cedar and rosemary in the fall. He'd spend the whole afternoon in the kitchen, even though Grandma had passed years earlier, insisting, the way stubborn old men do, that nobody made the turkey right except him. The dining room table was the same heavy oak one that had been in the family for 3 generations, long enough to seat the whole clan when everyone actually showed up. That year, everyone showed up. Aunt Clara and Uncle Robert came in from Richmond. My sister-in-law brought her twins, who spent the first 20 minutes chasing each other around the living room until Grandpa's stern glance sent them scrambling to their seats. Mark and I arrived a little late, held up by traffic on I-95, and slid into our usual spots near the head of the table, across from where Grandpa always sat like a quiet king presiding over his kingdom of mismatched dining chairs. The evening started exactly the way these evenings always do. Small talk, someone asking about the twins' soccer season, Uncle Robert complaining, good-naturedly, about his commute, the clink of serving spoons against ceramic dishes, candlelight flickering off the good silverware that only came out twice a year. And then the front door opened, and Bradley walked in. I want to be fair here, because I've turned this evening over in my head 100 times since, and I don't think Bradley is a bad person, exactly. I think he's a young man who joined the army for reasons that started out genuine, a desire to matter, to be part of something, and then let that desire curdle into something uglier the moment he realized that respect has to be built, not announced. He'd been commissioned as a first lieutenant 8 months earlier, straight out of a stateside training pipeline, and in every family gathering since, he had made absolutely certain that nobody in the room forgot it. He walked in that night in a crisp polo shirt that somehow still managed to look like a uniform, shoulders back, chin up, greeting people with the kind of firm handshake that seems less like a greeting and more like a challenge. He kissed his mother on the cheek, clapped his father on the shoulder, and made his way around the table like a politician working a room, before finally dropping into the empty chair almost directly across from me. "Sorry I'm late," he announced to the table, not sounding sorry at all. "Had a debrief run long, you know how it is when you're actually in the field." Nobody responded, but nobody needed to. Bradley had never required an audience's participation to keep talking. He just needed an audience. For the next 40 minutes, as plates were passed and wine was poured, Bradley held court. He told us about a land navigation exercise as though he'd personally liberated a village. He described a routine physical fitness test with the dramatic flair of a war memoir. He explained, unprompted, why real leadership could only be forged through the specific brand of discipline his branch apparently had a monopoly on, glancing meaningfully at his father's office job, at his cousin's teaching career, at anyone within earshot who hadn't chosen a uniform. I ate my dinner. I let Mark's hand rest on my knee under the table, warm and steady. I'd sat through a dozen versions of this speech at a dozen family functions, and I'd learned that the fastest way through it was silence and patience, the same tools that get you through a 6-month deployment without losing your mind. There's something people who haven't served rarely understand. The loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. In every unit I've ever worked with, the operators who mattered most, the ones you wanted next to you when things went sideways, were almost always the quietest people in the building. They didn't need to tell you they were good. You found out when it counted, and by then, words were beside the point. I've met men like Bradley before. Every branch has them. They mistake volume for authority and mistake other people's silence for agreement. I've learned not to correct that mistake unless I have to. That night, I had to. It happened right as the main course was being cleared, in that lull where conversation usually softens and people start eyeing the dessert table. Bradley had run out of fresh material about himself, and his eyes, a little glassy now, 2 glasses of wine deep, drifted across the table and landed on me. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face. I recognized it immediately, because I'd seen versions of it before, in briefing rooms and in bars near base, on the faces of men who couldn't quite square the existence of a woman in a flight suit with whatever picture they'd built in their heads of what real service looked like. "So Emily," he said, loud enough that the whole table turned to listen, "still playing sailor." A ripple went through the room, not quite a gasp, more like a collective flinch. Aunt Clara's fork paused over her plate. I didn't answer right away, and Bradley, mistaking my silence for an opening, kept going. "I mean, no offense," he said, in the tone people use right before they say something deeply offensive, but I've never really understood the Navy thing. Real operations happen on the ground. Boot. S in the dirt. That's where the actual work gets done. Half the fleet's just floating around out there, waiting for something to happen. Beside me, I felt Mark go rigid. His jaw tightened, his fork set down with a little more force than necessary. I kept my hand steady on my water glass. Bradley leaned forward, warming to his own performance now, clearly enjoying the discomfort spreading around the table like a stain. "Let's be honest," he said. "Your day's probably answering a few emails, sipping coffee in a nice climate-controlled office, maybe posing for a recruitment poster or two. Must be nice, getting a steady paycheck without ever actually facing real risk." I heard the twins go quiet across the room, sensing without understanding that something had shifted in the air. Mark's chair scraped back an inch, his body leaning forward, ready to say something sharp on my behalf. I put a hand lightly on his forearm, the same silent signal I'd give a junior crew member when I needed them to hold position and trust the plan. He glanced at me, read something in my expression, and settled back, jaw still tight. I'd weathered worse than Bradley. I'd weathered actual gunfire. His words were an inconvenience, not a wound. Causing a scene at Grandpa's table wasn't worth it, not for someone who was, in the end, just insecure and a little drunk on the sound of his own voice. But Bradley read my restraint as retreat. "Come on, Emily," he pushed, looking around for approval he wasn't going to get but was too far gone to notice he wasn't getting. "Admit it. While guys like me are out training in real conditions, preparing for whatever actually comes next, you're basically on a very long, very well-funded ocean cruise." The room went completely, utterly silent. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator through the kitchen doorway. I could hear my own pulse, slow and steady, the way it goes when your training takes over and your body simply refuses to panic even when part of you thinks maybe it should. I opened my mouth to respond, not angrily, just to set the record straight in the calm, level way I'd learned to speak in rooms where the wrong tone could cost you the whole conversation. I never got the chance. The sound came first. That single, sharp clink of metal against porcelain, deliberate and unhurried, cutting through the silence like something ceremonial. Grandpa Thomas set his fork down. I'd been at that table my whole life, at every holiday since I was a little girl in pigtails sneaking extra rolls off his plate, and I had never once seen him do what he did next. He lifted his head slowly. The warmth that had been sitting behind his eyes all evening, the soft, tired, contented look of a grandfather surrounded by his family, simply drained away, replaced by something older and harder and utterly unfamiliar to me. It was like watching a door open, onto a room none of us had ever been allowed into. He placed both hands flat on the table, weathered and steady, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Son," he said, looking directly at Bradley, "you'd better think very carefully about your next sentence." Bradley's grin didn't just fade, it collapsed. He straightened up in his chair like a man who just felt the floor shift under him. "Grandpa, come on," he said, a nervous laugh creeping into his voice. "I was just joking around. A little inter-service rivalry, that's all. Everybody does it." "A joke?" Grandpa repeated the word like he was turning it over in his hand, checking it for a flaw. "You sit at my table wearing the rank of an officer, and you don't carry an ounce of the bearing that's supposed to come with it. Tell me something, Lieutenant." He let the title hang in the air deliberately, and I watched Bradley flinch at the way it suddenly sounded less like a compliment and more like an accusation. "What exactly gives you the right to talk down another officer's service? What do you know about real leadership? About standing a watch through the darkest hours of the night, when the lives of the people around you depend entirely on whether you keep your head?" I just meant. Quiet. The word landed like a closed door. Bradley's mouth snapped shut. I'd never heard my grandfather use that tone with anyone. Not once in 20-plus years of knowing him. And yet everyone at that table, even the twins, even Aunt Clara, who had spent the whole meal laughing indulgently at Bradley's stories, went instantly, completely still, as though some old instinct had recognized the voice of command even in people who'd never served a day in their lives. It's time you learned what real service looks like, Grandpa said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There's a certain register some men speak in when they've earned the right to be believed without having to prove it, and Grandpa Thomas, quiet, unassuming. Grandpa Thomas, who spent most holidays doing nothing more dramatic than refilling the gravy boat, had apparently been speaking in that register the whole time, and none of us had known to listen for it. Stand up, Bradley. Bradley blinked, swallowed. For a moment I thought he might actually argue. But something in Grandpa's stillness made that impossible, and after a beat too long, Bradley pushed his chair back and stood, looking suddenly much younger than his uniform ever let him appear. Walk into my study, Grandpa said, pointing one steady finger down the hallway. On the mantel, there's a wooden case and a blue folder beside it. Bring them both back to this table. Now. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Bradley hesitated for one more second, glanced at his father, who offered him absolutely no help, no rescue, just a stiff, unreadable stare, and then turned and disappeared down the hallway. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I could hear his footsteps on the hardwood, fading, then returning. When he came back into the dining room, he was holding a heavy, unmarked wooden case in both hands like it might detonate, a slim blue leather folder balanced carefully on top of it. He set both items down in front of Grandpa with a care that hadn't been there in his earlier swagger. His hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Grandpa rested his palm flat against the lid of the case for a moment, almost like he was steadying himself, or maybe steadying the room. Then he slid the brass latches back with a practiced, unhurried motion and lifted the lid. Even from where I sat, I could see the deep navy velvet lining inside, and against it, arranged with obvious care, a row of decorations that caught the chandelier light and scattered it in small gold flashes across the tablecloth. Naval aviation warfare insignia, strike flight mission patches, an air medal with strike flight numerals, a Navy and Marine Corps commendation medal with a Combat V device. And resting slightly apart from the others, unmistakable even to people who'd never spent a day in uniform, a Purple Heart. Bradley's eyes went wide. For a second, something like relief crossed his face, an opening, a way to save himself. Grandpa, he said quickly, these are incredible. I had no idea you'd earned all of this. Seriously, it's an honor to even see it. Grandpa didn't smile, didn't blink. He simply exhaled, long and slow, a breath that seemed to carry decades in it, and set both hands flat on the table again. These aren't mine, Bradley. The room seemed to tilt slightly. What? Bradley's forced smile faltered. They belong to Emily. Every head at the table turned toward me at once. I felt my face go warm, not with embarrassment exactly, but with something closer to exposure, the particular discomfort of having a part of your life you deliberately kept private suddenly laid bare on your grandfather's dinner table in front of everyone you loved. Grandpa reached down, opened the blue folder, and drew out a single official document, heavy cream-colored paper, gold Department of the Navy seal, embossed at the top, dense block text beneath it. He slid it slowly across the table until it came to rest directly in front of Bradley's plate. Read it. Bradley looked down. I watched the color leave his face in real time, the way you watch a tide go out slow, then sudden, then completely gone. While you were telling us about routine training exercises, Grandpa said, and now he was speaking to the whole table, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room without ever rising. Lieutenant Emily Carter was serving as a tactical mission commander. 2 years ago, during a maritime security crisis in contested waters, she flew an MH-60 Seahawk through zero visibility, weather, under an active anti-air threat, to reach a patrol vessel that was taking on water and under direct fire. I stared down at my plate. I hadn't planned on this. I'd asked Grandpa years ago to simply hold onto the case for me, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I never wanted the story to become the reason anyone treated me differently, at home or anywhere else. I wanted to be Emily at the dinner table, not Lieutenant Carter. Some things you keep separate on purpose. She coordinated the emergency extraction of a downed aviator and 7 Allied personnel. Grandpa continued, quieter now, but somehow every word landed heavier than the last. and got every single one of them out alive, while evading direct hostile fire the entire time. She took shrapnel during that extraction. She refused medical evacuation until every member of her crew had been treated first. He looked at me then, and something in his weathered face softened in a way I'd never seen before, not pride exactly, or not only pride. Recognition. The particular, wordless understanding that exists between people who have stood in the kind of fire most others only read about. She never on. "She mentioned it to me directly," he said. "I found out because the Navy sent a citation to this address, thinking I was still listed as next of kin from years back. She asked me to hold on to the case so it wouldn't become a thing at family dinners." His eyes moved back to Bradley, and the softness disappeared, replaced by something flint-edged. "She has faced more danger before breakfast than you have seen in your entire career, son. And she has never once needed to announce it to feel like it mattered." Bradley stood frozen, staring down at the citation, at the gold seal, at the signature block near the bottom. His hand hovered over it like he wanted to touch it and confirm it was real, then thought better of it and pulled back. The twins had gone completely silent, watching their older cousin the way kids watch a magic trick go wrong. Aunt Clara's hand had drifted up to cover her mouth. Uncle Robert was staring at his son, with an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between disappointment and disbelief. "In case any of you were wondering," Grandpa added quietly, closing the folder, "that's what real work looks like. It doesn't need a microphone." I want to be honest about something. I felt no satisfaction watching Bradley's face collapse. I know that's probably not the ending people expect from a story like this. The villain gets humiliated, and the room cheers, and everyone goes back to their turkey feeling righteous. That's not how it actually felt, sitting there. What I felt mostly was tired. The specific exhaustion of having spent an entire evening, an entire career, really, absorbing small comments like Bradley's, deciding over and over again which ones were worth answering and which ones weren't, and then having the decision taken entirely out of my hands by a citation none of us had asked to bring to the table. Bradley finally looked up from the document and met my eyes. All the swagger, all the performance from earlier in the evening had drained completely out of him. What was left looked almost young, a 26-year-old man realizing, in real time, in front of his entire family, exactly how badly he'd misjudged the room. "Emily," he said, and his voice actually cracked on my name. "I am so sorry, I had absolutely no idea. I spoke completely out of line and I was wrong about all of it. About you, about your service, about assuming I knew anything about what you've been through. Please, I mean it, I'm sorry." I thought about all the ways I could respond. I thought about every version of "I told you so" available to me, every cutting remark that would have been, honestly, well within my rights to make after 40 minutes of condescension. I didn't reach for any of them. "Apology accepted, Bradley," I said, and I meant it. "Just remember, every uniform carries weight you can't always see from the outside. Doesn't matter which branch. Let your actions speak for you from now on, not your volume." He nodded, staring down at the tablecloth, and didn't say another word for the rest of the meal. Grandpa Thomas picked his fork back up, calm and unhurried, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened, and gave me one small, knowing nod across the table. The kind of look that passes only between people who have carried something heavy and came out the other side of it changed. Mark's hand found mine under the table again, and this time he didn't try to hide how proud he looked. Rest of dinner continued, quieter than before but not uncomfortably so. Aunt Clara asked me gently if I wanted to talk about what happened out there. I told her honestly that I mostly didn't, and she respected that without pushing. The twins, for the first time all evening, looked at me like I'd stepped straight out of one of their storybooks. Uncle Robert refilled my water glass without being asked, which is about as close as some men get to saying, "I'm sorry my son acted like that." I've thought about that dinner a lot since, turning it over the way you turn over any moment that shifts something permanently inside a family. Here's what I keep coming back to. Bradley wasn't wrong to be proud of his service. Every uniform matters. Every person who raises their hand and signs their name to something bigger than themselves deserves respect for that choice, regardless of which branch, which job, which patch on their shoulder. What Bradley got wrong wasn't wearing the uniform, it was mistaking loudness for legitimacy. He thought respect was something you announced into existence at a dinner table, one bragging story at a time. He hadn't learned yet, and maybe, hopefully, that night taught him that respect doesn't work that way. It's not handed out to whoever talks the longest. It's earned quietly, in rooms nobody's watching, doing work nobody claps for. That's the thing about real competence, in any field, in any uniform, in any life. It rarely needs to raise its voice. The Navy taught me at in the cockpit, under pressure, when the only thing that mattered was whether I could keep my hands steady and my mind clear. Grandpa Thomas, it turned out, had learned the exact same lesson decades before me, in circumstances he still, to this day, has never fully described to anyone at that table, including me. I still don't know everything about what he did to earn the right to speak in that voice. He's never told the full story, and I've never pushed him to. Some things I've learned don't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. You just recognize them, instantly, the way the whole room recognized it that night, the particular gravity of someone who has actually been tested, sitting quietly among people who mostly haven't. Bradley and I are civil now. Better than civil, actually. A few months after that dinner, he reached out and asked, genuinely, if I'd be willing to talk to him sometime about leadership under pressure, not as a lecture, just as a conversation between two officers who happen to be family. We've had that conversation a few times since. He's different now. Quieter. He still tells stories at family dinners, but they're shorter, and they're usually about other people's contributions instead of his own. Grandpa Thomas still refuses to talk about what's in that wooden case beyond what I've already shared with you here. He still sits at the head of that same oak table every holiday, quiet and unassuming, refilling gravy boats, and asking the twins about their soccer season, giving no indication whatsoever that underneath that calm exterior is a man who once commanded the kind of authority that can silence a room with a single word. That's the lesson I keep coming back to, the one I try to carry with me both in and out of uniform. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. Real strength doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause, and it definitely doesn't need to remind anyone of what it's capable of. It just quietly sets down its fork when it finally needs to be heard, and the whole room listens. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever watched someone get humbled by nothing more than the truth, sitting right there on the table in front of them? Tell me in the comments, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like and share.